mevorach. La 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 la. Baruch Adonai mevorach leolam vaed. You may be seated. We're on 28. חי וקיים תמיד ולוחלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני המוהרים ערבים. 29. אהבת עולם בית שלך. כי הם חיינו ויולך ימינו ונגבי הלילה ועבד כל תשים אמנו לעולמים ברכתו אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. Oh, wait, I'm not doing that.
הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך וקשרתם להיות על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובישעריך ביום ישועה תשמעו מצוותי אשר אנוכי מצווה אתכם. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם ויעשו להם ציצית על כנפי בגדיהם לדורותם ונתנו על ציצית הכנף פתיל תכלת והיה לכם לציצית הוריתם אותו וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני ועשיתם אותם ולא תתורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם אשר אתם זונים אחריהם למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם אלוהים אני אדוני אלוהיכם אדוני אלוהיכם אמת אמונה כל זאת וקיים עלינו.
ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ובני ישראל הכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם
Adonai
ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גואל ישראל
השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום ועמידנו מלכנו לחיים ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך ותקננו בעצה טובה מלפניך ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך ברוך אתה אדוני הפורס סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים
וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה וילמד יברך חירותי וימליך מלכותי בחייכון וביום איכון ובחיי כל בית ישראל בגלה ובזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן שמר רבא בורך ילוויה יתברך וישתבח ויתבואן ויתרומם הזה ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שם עדי קודשה בריחו ליילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה במירון ויאמרה ויאמרו
יתגדל ויקדש שמי רבה בעלמה דיברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי. בחייכון ובימיכון ובחידכון בית ישראל בגלה ובזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם אלומי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ינשא וידבר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשו בריחו לילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבע ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה ויאמרו אמן. תקבל צלון הון ובעד הון דכל ישראל קודם אבהון דבשמיא ויאמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן. Please rise. Oh, you've risen. For the Kiddush, the Yom Tov Kiddush is on page 50. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol am ורוממנו מכל לשון, וקידשנו במצוותיו, ותיתן לנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה מועדים לשמחה, חגים וזמנים לששון, את יום חג השבועות הזה, זמן מתן תורתנו, מקרא קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים, כי בנו בחרת, ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים, ומועדי קודשך בשמחה ובששון הנחלתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש ישראל והזמנים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
We turn to page 51 for Aleinu. Aleinu לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמענו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגוי עלינו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. כן נקבל לך? הכתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, היה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא, ביום ההוא, יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
Kaddish is on page 52. All others may be seated. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
V'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute. V'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uv'yizman kari v'imru. Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam ol'amei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal shmei dekudusha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushvechata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. And you may be seated.
Gather a bunch. Let's gather them, put them back. Thanks so much. The festivals of the Jewish year have a wonderful quality of drama to them. When Sukkot comes, we tell the story of our trek through the desert from Egypt to Canaan, from the house of bondage to the promised land. But simply telling the story isn't sufficient. The tradition bids us to go outside and actually live in a sukkah, to sleep and eat and live in a sukkah, and to feel what it's like to be vulnerable, to be outside with nothing over your head but branches. So if it rains on you. And if it's warm, the sun shines on you. And if the wind blows, it blows you. On Passover, we tell the story of our Exodus, but again, it's not sufficient simply to tell the story or commemorate the activity, the event. We eat what they ate. We eat the bread of slaves. We eat matzah. We taste the bitterness of maror, the bitterness of slavery. And then we celebrate the sweetness of liberation with 4 glasses of wine and endless boxes of chocolate matzah. That's a matter of experiencing it again. The Seder is the last night we were in Egypt. We experience it again. On Purim, we're going to tell the story of Esther's triumph over Haman. Again, it's not enough simply to tell the story. You have to actually carry out the ancient Jewish curse of Yimach Shemo by drowning out his name every time it is mentioned in the synagogue reading of the book of Esther. When it comes to Shavuot, Shavuot is the holiday of first fruits. So tonight we're going to have cheesecake. Don't ask me what that's about. I don't know. I grew up in a baker's house. It put me through college, so it's an important mitzvah in my life. And we're going to do what our ancestors do. We're going to receive Torah. Our ancestors stood at Mount Sinai receiving Torah, and so the tradition is to stay up all night long. I'm glad you're ready for that, to hear Torah all night long. And we're going to study as long as we possibly can until we all drop from exhaustion. The name Tikkun is actually a Kabbalistic name because according to the teachings of the Kabbalah, the quality of God called din. Din is judgment, din is separation. The quality of din, of quality of separation, goes to sleep late at night, and that's a good time to bring things together that have been separated. So all year long, we've been separated from the words of Torah. Tonight, we get to do a tikkun, to hold them together as one, and to re-experiencing the joy and exhilaration of the giving of Torah. And that's what we do tonight. It is a Tikkun Leyl Shavuos. You're invited to stay all night, sleep here on the floor, and in the morning explain to Yossi Dresner who the hell you are. You don't have to stay all night if you don't want to. You can stay as long as you can. Tonight, what we'd like to do is to talk about 2 great stories. We are a people of storytellers. We experience our history through our stories. We experience our ethics through our stories. And in modernity, in this last century, the Jewish people have experienced two remarkable events, the stories of which we have not yet settled upon. The first is the Holocaust, the greatest moment of destruction in all of Jewish history. And the second is the reinvention, the reestablishment of a state of Israel, of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, which may be the most powerful redemptive moment in all of Jewish history. You have that much power in one century. We haven't yet figured out what the stories are. So Rabbi Leibowitz and I would like tonight to present some of the thinking about what stories we wish to tell about these remarkable events. We'd like to begin with a little bit of music, which is another way we tell some stories. Our first conversation will be about Eastern European Jewry, its destruction through the Holocaust, and we'd like to ask the cantors to present us a piece of music that tells that story.
There were a surprising number of musical pieces written during the Holocaust. Music reflects our joy, our sadness, our grief, and it tells stories. I personally have two stories to tell in song. The first one is written by Leyl Rudnitska. She was a poet who lived in the Vilna ghetto, and she wrote many songs. But this one was about something very real. There were a number of children who were left without their parents when the parents had to flee suddenly, when they were murdered suddenly, and a child found him or herself suddenly alone. And she adopted one such child in the Vilna ghetto. And she sang this song about this poor child. We have the lyrics up on the screen. We had them a moment ago. Okay. Okay, sure. It's called Dremlenfegel. Maybe you know it. The English words are, birds are dreaming in the branches. Sleep, my dear child. By your cradle, on your cot, sits a stranger and sings, Loo, 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 loo. Somewhere your cradle stood, braided with good fortune, and your mother, your mother, will never return. Loo, 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 loo. I saw your father running under a hail of stones. Over the fields there flew his orphaned cry. Loo, 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 loo. So it's a lullaby, but an ironic one. Dremlenfegel läuft die Zweigen, schlaf mein teuer Kind, bei dein Wiegel Narre, siehst da Fremde und sie, bei dein Wiegel Narren, siehst da Fremde und sie. Lulu, 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 Lulu. Where's the one who rocked your cradle? It brought joy to her. But your mother, your mother will return no more. But your mother, your mother will return no more. Lulu, 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 Lulu. Palmenvögel auf die Zweige, schlaf mein Kind, bei dein Wiegel andere siehst der Fremden sie, bei dein Wiegel andere siehst der Fremden sie. Lulu, 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 Lulu,
One of the moving, for me, the most moving of all the Yiddish poetry and stories about the Holocaust was a poem by the Yiddish poet laureate, we called him in my Yiddish school. His name was Leivik Halpern, but he went under the name of Hey Leivik. This number, Yidele Fidele, The Boy and the Fiddle, I heard for the first time when I was 7 years old. A grade 2 teacher, I was singing in the Talmud Torah choir, he said, "This is a good song for you because it's about Jewish children and you're a Jewish child." And most of the kids in the class were children of Holocaust survivors. I'm going to read it for you. I'll just look at the Yiddish words and give it to you in English rather than a synopsis. I just find it so powerful that I'll take an extra 30 seconds. The heart of a 7-year-old boy lies just before death on a golden fiddle. And the heart of a 7-year-old little girl dies with her head falling against the fiddle. And this is his Kaddish to World War II jury. When Menschen gehen, people are walking, the people of the world. Gehen durch vorbei, they walk by, and they see this. Und sie sagen nicht a viele, ay, ay, ay. Oh my God, look what's happening. Get a plot. One of the strings starts playing by itself. Who killed you, little boy? Who killed you, little girl? And the heart of the little boy starts shaking and going in a circle like a ring. And you hear beautiful words. The little girl says, "Let's die and not cry anymore." Zogdos Meidele, the little girl says, "I'll listen to you, but play something for me one more time on your fiddle." She says, "Noch do ein ganze starke Strunele." You still have one good string that plays. And listen to this optimism of this little girl. She finishes her speech saying, "Und es scheint noch in der Heuch a pitzel Zunele." And I see just a little bit of sunshine coming for the Jews. So the little boy's heart starts to shake, and he plays on his last time on his fiddle. All my little brothers are gone. They were such good little boys. They were such good little Jews. Alle haben sie gehabt so eine schwarze Egelach. They all had such beautiful eyes. And you, my little sister, were with me, but they took you away too. Schlaf je ein in eine mit mein Liedele. So fall asleep together with my song auf die Runden von dem golden Fiedel. On the golden fiddle. And Leivik repeats these two lines. Menschen gehen, and people walk by, gehen durch, vorbei und sie schreien nicht da viele. Ai, ai, ai. Das Herzl von a 7-jährig Jüngele liegt und geusses wie vergolden Fiedele. Und das Herzl von a 7-jährig Mädele Staub dazu gefallen zu dem Fiedelschädele. Und Menschen gehen durch vorbei und sie sorgen nicht da viele. Ai, ai, ai. Gibt a Platz von sich allein, a Strunele mit a Jomer. Wer hat dich der Mordet, Sunele? Wer hat dich der Stochen, Mädele? Gibt a Zappel sich das Herzl von dem Ingele und a Keikel, wie es keikelt sich a Ringele. Und es der Herrn sich a so eine Wärter edele. Wo mir starben und ich klogen, Mädele. Sag das Mädele, I listen to you, I'll listen to you. Ich will dich folgen, Ingele, aber spiel etwas von mir. Noch einmal auf dein Fiedele. Es ist noch da ein ganzes starkes Tunnele und es scheint noch in der Heuch a Pitzel Sunnele. Geht a Zappel sich das Herzl von dem Ingele auf sein letzter Strunne in a Fieberliedele umgekommen seinen alle meine Brüderla alle seinen sie gewöhn a so eine gute Ingelach alle seinen sie gewöhn a so eine schöne Jiederlach alle haben sie gehabt a so eine schwarze Egelach und euch umgekommen sind alle meine Schwesterlach in a so eine helle Kleiderlach mit Kästerlach bist du eine mir geblieben zu der Schädele hat man dich euch zugenommen Schwester Mädele schlaf sie ein fall asleep in einem mit meinen Liederle with my song auf die Rang und mein golden Fiedele und Menschen gehen durch vorbei. Sie sorgen nicht da viele.
as the Second World War was coming to an end, at the end of 1944 and the beginning of 1945, the Russian army moving westward across Eastern Europe, reconquering the lands of Poland and the other countries of Eastern Europe from the Nazis. The Nazis packed up whoever was left in the concentration camps and moved them westward into Germany. They call this a march of death. My uncle was on one of these. My uncle, who had been a slave laborer in Auschwitz, he was one of the guys that actually built Auschwitz, joined a death march of 3,500 men who left Poland and walked into Germany together. Only 700 survived the walk. And then he was put into an out camp of the Buchenwald concentration camp, where eventually he was liberated by the American army. In 1988, 3 Israeli educators came up with this idea of recreating that march, but in reverse, of bringing Jewish young people from all over the world to the Auschwitz concentration camp to walk not out of the camp, but into the camp for a celebration of our renewal in our life. And they called this the March of the Living. This year was the 35th March of the Living. 55 members of our community, many of whom were here tonight, participated on that march. 13,000 people from all over the world. 10,000 young people and 3,000 old farts, all together, marching. Kids from Brazil, we could tell where they came from because they all wore different colored t-shirts. The Brazilian kids wore these green and yellow t-shirts. Venezuelan kids had purple t-shirts. The Colombian kids had red t-shirts. The kids from Cincinnati had purple t-shirts. Everybody had different colored t-shirts. All the grown-ups wore white t-shirts, so you could tell who they were. And we participated in this program, the 35th March of the Living. We started in Krakow. Now, quickly, here's the geography of this. The Nazis maintained 40,000 camps, 40,000 transit camps, concentration camps, and work camps. But 6 of them were centers for death. They were all located in population centers in Poland. So Dachau, for example, which you can visit because it's right outside of Munich, was not a death camp. It was actually a camp for political prisoners originally. It has a crematoria in it because people died of starvation and disease. But the purpose of Dachau was to just incarcerate political prisoners and Jewish activists, not to kill them. Auschwitz, Birkenau, which is one camp. Treblinka, Auschwitz is outside of Krakow. Treblinka, which is outside of Warsaw. Majdanek, which is outside of Lublin. Chelmno, Sobibor, and Belzec were the 6 death camps. Their purpose was nothing else except to exterminate, murder Jews. We visited 3 of them. We visited Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, and Treblinka. And each one of us was really touched by this experience. And then after the ceremony in the Auschwitz camp and after visits to these concentration camps and after a Shabbos in Warsaw, we flew to Israel for Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. It's sort of shock therapy. Because the 2 experiences were such contrasts. Because the experience on the one hand of the massive effort to murder the Jews of Europe. And that's what the experience was. Auschwitz is a double camp. Auschwitz I was once a Polish military base. It's a relatively small campus, looks like a college campus with red brick buildings. And it has 1 crematoria in it for people who accidentally died while they were being held there. Birkenau, which is 1.25 miles away, Birkenau was a death camp. Birkenau is 2 miles square. That's how big it is. It's as big as a city. Some of it's been rebuilt. The crematoria center, and there were 6 of them. One of them is bombed out, but almost standing, and you can see it. You can stand next to it, which we did, and recited Male and recited Kaddish there. The industrial size of this effort is so unbelievably undescribable. Treblinka, on the other hand, was completely destroyed by the Nazis at the end of the war. It's in a quiet forest just outside of Warsaw. Treblinka had no slave laborers. Treblinka had no survivors. Treblinka was a place where Warsaw Jewry was murdered. That's the only reason the place existed. And the peaceful quiet of that forest portrays the scream of this place. Majdanek was a slave labor camp. Much of it's still there outside of Lublin. But the chilling part of Majdanek is that at the end of the camp, you have to walk about a mile and a half to the end of the camp, to where the crematoria are, and they're still there. At the end of the war, the Nazis wanted to make one last push. They wanted to give Hitler a birthday present of destroying all the Jews of Lublin. And so they gathered up 40,000, and in 1 week, they killed 40,000 Jews. And they didn't have enough time to dispose of the ashes of the bodies that they destroyed, so they kept them in a mountain. And we stood beside that mountain of ashes. The Polish government has since put a canopy over it as a reminder of what was done here. The industrial size, the massive effort to destroy Polish Jews, to destroy the Jews of Europe, to destroy the Jewish people. That's the first thing that strikes you. And then we get to Israel. And the second thing that strikes you is the muscular assertion of Jewish life. A remarkable assertion that we are alive and we are creative and we are as rebellious and as ruckus as we've ever been. They put aside all of the political demonstrations for that week because of the two sacred days of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. But there was still this tremendous sense of tension and patriotism. We were invited, we were the only group, by the way, invited to the National Memorial Service at the Kotel. And the National Memorial Service for those fallen in battle in Israel's wars held at the Kotel. The principal speakers were the president of the country, Herzog, right, and the chief of staff, Herzl Halevi. And they both spoke in such beautiful language, beautiful poetic Hebrew, about the sacrifices made by families to maintain this dream of a land of Israel. Herzog talked about going to the National Memorial, the National Cemetery, which is on Har Herzl, and one block of that cemetery, and he talked about each grave. This one who came from Libya and took up a rifle to defend the state in 1948 and fell in battle. And this one who came from Paris and took up a rifle to defend the state in 1948. And this one who came from Poland and survived the concentration camp and took up a rifle. And each one of them, and he talked about each one of this in just one line. Herzl Halevi, who's the chief of staff of the Israeli military, who looks like someone's central casting idea of an Israeli military officer, square jaw, brilliant, big, strong guy wearing the red beret of his paratroopers unit. He talked about the first time as a young officer 35 years earlier when he had to go to a family and tell them that their son had fallen in battle. He was a young lieutenant, and it is incumbent upon the officer to make a personal visit to the family to tell them who their son was, how he died. And talking about climbing the stairs to that apartment and praying to himself that those stairs would never end because he didn't want to walk into that apartment. And knocking on the door and entering the apartment and realizing that the two people he were talking to were both survivors of the Holocaust, and this was their only son who had just died in the war. And how he began to get emotional, and how they assured him, no, he died for a dream. And they comforted him. And he tells this story. He's a huge military guy telling this story, which was just quite remarkable. And then the very next day, I don't know if you've been to Israel on these days, there's Yom HaZikaron, and then the very next day is Yom HaAtzmaut. You go from the saddest day in this country's calendar to its happiest. siren is sounded, and then the country goes berserk. And wherever we went, there was celebration. We were in Tel Aviv, and our bus driver said, you know, I'm not going to be able to get you out of here, so if you want to go back to Jerusalem, come with me now. Half of the group stayed in Tel Aviv and went to Kaplan Square for that celebration, and half of the group went back to Jerusalem. Nina and I went back to Jerusalem. We were staying at the Leonardo Plaza Hotel, a lovely hotel, by the way, with a very good breakfast. And the only problem is that right next to it is the Independence Park, where the biggest celebration in Jerusalem took place. And unfortunately, it was, I don't know how many of you love hip-hop music. But if you did, you would have loved that hotel, because until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, it was Israeli hip-hop music, played at blasting volumes in front of thousands of screaming young people. It's not my cup of tea, so Nina and I took a walk around, and in Safra Square, which is the square in front of the town hall, they had a stage set up, and they had more traditional Zionist music, the kind of junk that I grew up with. Zungali Gali, that sort of thing. And that was great, and Nina danced a while, and I got to just watch it. It was quite beautiful. And then we walked up Jaffa Road, which is closed to traffic, and the train wasn't running. And there were thousands of young people up and down this street, and someone got it into their head that the way you should celebrate the rebirth of the Jewish people after the Shoah and the establishment of the State of Israel is by spritzing blue and white shaving cream all over people. So there were these kids with these giant cans of this spritzing just about everybody. I don't see that in the Talmud, but it's somewhere. And there was another stage with more music, and the celebration just went on the entire day. And then the next day, the March of the Living marched a second time. The first time we marched from Auschwitz to Birkenau. We recreated the Death March. The second time we marched from Safra Square to the Kotel. We marched the March of Life, a renewal, of rebirth. And that was our experience. Everyone who was on that had a very different experience, different emotions. But all of us it was that kind of a lifetime experience. One of the questions that we asked ourselves on this trip was as follows. There were a couple of survivors. A couple of people who had survived the concentration camps. Now, you can do the math. Anyone who was adult enough to be able to tell the story is in their mid-90s, late 90s at this point. There were a few of them left, and we honored them together with the kids. In the next decade, the last survivor will leave us. In the next decade, the last person who survived the concentration camps, the ghettos, the atrocities, will leave this world. And when that happens, the Shoah, the Holocaust, will go from memory to history. There's a big difference between memory and history. Memory is testimony. It's what I saw. It's what I felt. It's what I experienced. History involves a construction. First of all, it's a selection of an infinite number of events, of moments, of catastrophes, of atrocities, of redemptions, an infinite number of events. You choose which ones you want to tell. And then you draw a line among them. Remember those old puzzles with the dots on the page? You draw the line and try to create a picture. History is a construction of creating a picture. And the serious question that stands before our generation is what picture we will draw among all of the events of the Holocaust. What story shall we tell? What story shall we tell? Just to give you an example, the Exodus from Egypt took place 1,500 years before zero. The Seder that we celebrate on Pesach was created in around the year 100 by the rabbis of the Mishnah. The rabbis did not tell the whole story. They made a selection. For one thing, we were slaves in Egypt for 4 or 5 generations, but Pesach isn't about slavery. It's about liberation. It's about liberation. You have a Seder plate at home. It has 5 or 6 items, only one of which is bitter. And you don't eat the maror straight. You eat it dipped in haroseh. Think about this. The rabbis wanted to tell a story about Egypt, but they decided to tell the story of our liberation, not of our enslavement. They decided to tell the story of the glory of a God of history who is on the side of the slave and liberates the slave from Egypt, not the generations that were crushed under Pharaoh's projects, not the souls that were lost to Pharaoh's cruelty. They made a decision. And they made that decision very deliberately because they wanted to say to us that we are part of a history that moves from Egypt to Canaan. We are part of a history that moves from slavery to freedom. We are part of a history that moves from a house of bondage to a promised land. We are part of a history that moves from oppression to redemption. That's why the beginning of your Seder is Halachma Anya Da'achlu Avatana Da'ar de Mitzrayim. The poor, flat, tasteless bread of slaves. And at the end of the Seder, matzah is magically transformed into the bread of liberation. What we ate because we didn't have a time to call for pizza before Moses took us out. Maror at the beginning is the mortar that put together Pharaoh's blocks, and at the end becomes the sweetness that mellows. Haroset is the mortar, and at the end sweetens the bitterness of the maror. The first line of the Seder is about the bitterness of being a slave. And the last line of the Seder is, depending on which version of the Haggadah you use, is either Eliyahu Hanavi, or L'Shana Haba Yerushalayim, or the end of Chad Gadya, right? Ve'ata Kodesh Baruch Hu v'shagav l'malcham avis. God comes and destroys death, the ultimate slavery, redemption. The rabbis chose to tell us a story of redemption, not a story of enslavement, because they wanted to liberate us from the bitterness of our experience. So now what story do we tell? What story do we tell about the Shoah? For those of you who've been around for a while, in 1963, which is very early in this process, Rabbi Shulweiss, then a very young rabbi in Oakland, California, wrote an article. His kids came home from Hebrew school and told him about a game they played where half of the class were Nazis and half of the class were Jews. And Shulweiss was appalled by this. And he wrote an article and he asked this question: when I tell my children the story of the Holocaust, what do I do to them? If I tell them that every non-Jew is a Nazi, that every Christian hates Jews, that everyone outside of our circle is out to get us, what do I do to their conscience? What do I do to their spirit? What do I do to their vision of the world? I put a block on their hearts. Sure, I said, I don't know what story to tell, but I know I can't tell it the way that it's being told now. Because it's not giving them Jewish hope, it's giving them Jewish rage and Jewish bitterness. Bitterness doesn't go well with Judaism. And then, in 1966, he made a discovery. He was giving a speech at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, and the owner of the hotel for the Federation, the owner of the hotel was one philanthropist named Benjamin Swig, who asked him to come over to the corner. He wanted to introduce him to somebody. And he called over the maintenance manager of the hotel, a very big guy wearing a coverall named Fritz Graber. Told Fritz, tell the rabbi your story. And Mr. Graber said, no, it's a Fritz, tell him your story. Fritz Graber was a member of the Nazi Party. He's German national, member of the Nazi Party during the war. He had a construction company. He owned a construction company. And because he was a member of the Nazi Party, he got many contracts to build defense installations along the Eastern Front. And as he was building these defense installations for the Nazi armies along the front, he watched what was happening to Jews in Poland and Ukraine. And it sickened him. It sickened him that his German people, who were so humanistic, were destroying the lives of innocent people, non-combatants, just plain folks. And Fritz Graber, member of the Nazi Party, contractor for the Nazi government, made a decision. He had the power to recruit Jewish slave laborers. And any Jew who was working for his company was immune from the Gestapo. So he started pulling Jews off of trains and out of ghettos and putting them to work in his construction projects. And when he had not enough projects, he had too many Jews and not enough projects, he would put them on trains and send them across the Ukraine and across Poland and move them around. And by the end of the war, he had 5,500 Jews on his payroll who were immune from the Nazis. They couldn't touch them. The Nazis caught on, the Gestapo caught on, and they came after him. So Fritz Graeber crossed the lines and gave himself up to the American army. And at first they incarcerated him, and then some of the Jews that he saved came by and said, no, this man is a hero. So they repatriated him to Germany after the end of the war, and he testified in the Nuremberg trials against the concentration camp commandants who had done those atrocities that he'd witnessed. And he became a person non grata in Germany, so he moved to San Francisco, and Benjamin Swig gave him a job. The man saved 5,500 Jewish people, and nobody knew his name. Even now, no one knows his name. And Rabbi Schulweis said, what did we ever do to thank you? And Fritz Graeber said, you don't have to do anything to thank me. I did what I was supposed to do. And that became Rabbi Schulweis' Rabbi Schulweis decided that the way to tell the story of the Holocaust was to tell the story of rescuers. Now, this was very controversial. He gave this as a sermon in 1976. I remember that sermon. And then he published it in the pages of Moment magazine. And the novelist Cynthia Ozick wrote a response and said that he's a Holocaust denier, because the number of rescuers is so minuscule compared to the number of perpetrators. And Schulweis said, who cares? As long as there was somebody. This is his words. I gave it to you on this sheet, so let's take a look. It is not the memory of the Holocaust, but the abuse of the Holocaust that is troubling, for we distort its meaning. Disillusioned by the massive failures of churches, governments, and statesmen, some of us inadvertently raise hatred of the Jew to the heights of metaphysical fatalism. Metaphysical fatalism means there's nothing you can do about it. Jew hatred was, is, and will be the eternal hatred for an eternal people. There was an Israeli song that came out in 1976 called Kol Ha'olam Negdenu. The whole world is against us. The whole world is against us. And that's what he's responding to. If that's what you learned from the Holocaust, Schulweis says, I have a problem. That growing melancholy judgment has led to a radical polarization of the world into two camps. They who persecute us, and we who suffer. So whenever he would go to churches, and he went frequently because he was invited a lot, or to college campuses, Schulweis would talk about Christian rescuers. And some people would say, you shouldn't do that. You should bang these people over the head with what they did. And his answer was, the ear which is gently opened by testimony righteous Gentiles is more ready to admit the awesome noise of atrocity. It is as important to celebrate the Christian family that hid Anne Frank's family as it is to condemn those who betrayed the hunted. Why is the memory of the good wiped out and only the memory of the wicked preserved? Further, Jewish and Christian world needs to know of heroes, for until now it has seemed only the strength of villains. Character education of the post-Holocaust generation requires models of moral heroism to emulate. That is the essential goal in the moral use of our people's history. That's one way to tell the story. That's how Schulweis did it. I want to show you two other examples of this. Abraham Joshua Heschel was born and raised in Warsaw, went to Berlin to write his PhD, came back to Warsaw 6 weeks before the war began to publish his PhD thesis, and he begged his family to leave Warsaw because he saw what was coming, because he was living in Berlin, because he saw the rise of the Nazis in Berlin. Heschel couldn't get his family to leave. His uncle was the Rebbe of a large Hasidic community. The community couldn't leave, so the Rebbe couldn't leave. And Heschel's mother, who was the uncle's sister, couldn't leave her brother and her daughters, so they stayed. Heschel kissed them goodbye, went to London, and then came to America. never saw any member of his family again. They were all killed in Auschwitz and Treblinka. In 1941, he gives a speech. He had not yet learned English, so he gave this speech in Yiddish. And the speech came right after they told him that his family had been destroyed. There's a chilling moment in his biography, the biography of Rabbi Heschel. He is a teacher at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And the president of the college and two of his students who spoke Yiddish, because he didn't speak English yet, came to his dormitory room. And they showed them the dispatch from the Joint Distribution Committee, the European agency that confirmed that Heschel's family had been destroyed in Auschwitz and Treblinka. It deeply affected him. It deeply touched him. So he gave this talk in 1941, and then he changed it, rewrote it, and expanded it in 1943. It's called The Meaning of This Hour. We have trifled with the name of God. We have taken ideals in vain. We have called for the Lord. He came and was ignored. We have preached but eluded him. We have praised but defied him. Now we reap the fruits of our failure. The taste for the good has all but gone from the earth. Men heap spite upon cruelty, malice upon atrocity. Let modern dictatorships not serve as an alibi for our conscience. We have failed to fight for right, for justice, for goodness. As a result, we must fight against wrong, against injustice, against evil. We have failed to offer sacrifices on the altar of peace. Thus, we offer sacrifices on the altar of war. Skip the next paragraph for just a moment. The outbreak of this war was no surprise. Now, that's a hell of a statement. This is in 1943. The outbreak of this war was no surprise. It came as a long-expected sequel to spiritual disaster, instilled with the gospel that truth is mere advantage and reverence weakness. People succumb to the bigger advantage of a lie. The Jew is our misfortune, and the power of arrogance. Tomorrow the whole world shall be ours. The people's democracies must depend upon force. The roar of bombers over Rotterdam, Warsaw, and London was an echo of thoughts bred for years by individual brains and later applauded by entire nations. It was through our failure that people started to suspect that science is a device for exploitation, parliaments, pulpits for hypocrisy, religion a pretext for bad conscience. In the tantalized souls of those who had faith and ideals, suspicion became a dogma and contempt the only solace. Mistaking the abortions of their conscience for intellectual heroism, many thinkers employ clever pens to scold and scorn the reverence for life. What he says is that before you have concentration camps, before you have genocide, before you have atrocity, you have ideas. What are the ideas that gave rise to these atrocities? It was a moral cynicism, says Heschel. A moral cynicism that gave up on the idea that there could be good and evil in the world and that it's our responsibility to resist the evil and to promote the good. That line about moral abortion, that is abortion of conscience, to cut out conscience, to not care, to not feel it, to not be outraged by evil, and to think that that's intellectual sophistication. That indifference is a form of intellectual sophistication, says Heschel, that's the crime. And the Holocaust begins in that crime. And so he spends his life, Abraham Heschel does, trying to reverse this. He says at the end here that we must rescue the souls of men from the pit. He spends his life trying to return a sensibility of moral conscience, action, of speaking out to Western civilization, trying to return human beings to a sensibility that when we see evil in the world, we say something, we act. And at the end, he makes he has a remarkable image. In the Bible, it's a Shavuot image. That's why it's so poignant. In the Bible, we came to Mount Sinai, and the Torah says that the people Israel gathered Tachat Hahar, which they mean by at the foot of the mountain. But the literal meaning of the word Tachat Hahar means underneath the mountain. So there's a midrash in the Talmud that says at that moment the people of Israel gathered and God picked up the mountain and held it over them and said, how would you like my Torah? How would you like my Torah? If you want my Torah, good, I'll put the mountain down and we'll go on as before. If you don't want the Torah, this is going to be your grave. That's the midrash. More about that some other time. What Heschel says is now God holds the mountain over us again. God holds the mountain over us again and says, either you're going to become people who join me in the drama of redemption, or you're going to destroy this planet. And you're going to destroy everyone who lives on it. Because the ideas that gave rise to the destruction of European Jewry will give rise to the destruction of everybody at one point. So for Heschel, the story is a story about the awakening of conscience. The story is a story about acting in the world. The story is about living with a sensibility that keeps our eyes open to what is happening around us and gives us a sense of deep responsibility to the world that we live in. That's the story that Heschel told. That's the story that Heschel told about the Holocaust. And so in 1965, his friend Martin Luther King invites him to come to Selma, Alabama. And Heschel puts away his books, packs his bags, and goes down to Selma. And together with the other leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement, crosses the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And when a reporter came to him and said, what are you doing? You're a rabbi. You're supposed to be praying. Heschel's answer was, I pray with my feet. Because a man who saw the destruction of everything dear to him in the world goes to the South, goes to the American South, and sees racism there, and sees an echo of the same hatred that destroyed his family. The same hatred that destroyed his family, and he couldn't live with it. So for Heschel, the story is a story about conscience. One more. You okay with one more? Yeah, no, there's cheesecake coming, I promise you. So you're going to get cheesecake as a reward for sitting through all this. There's one more. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon. It was an important war. The purpose of the war was to finally rid Israel of the threat from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. The Israelis went up to the Litani River, which is what they told the Americans they were going to do. And then they realized that Arafat was defenseless in Beirut. So they went beyond the Litani River, they went into Beirut. And they bottled up Arafat. They bottled up Arafat and they put an end to the threat of the PLO in that part of the country. The world condemned Israel. Because at this point it was no longer a defensive war. Up to that point it was a defensive war. All of Israel's wars were defensive wars. 1948, 1956, maybe 1967, certainly 1973, certainly. But this one in 1982, that was no longer defensive. This was offensive. And people started criticizing. And Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister, gave a very famous speech where he said, first of all, the world that stood by while we died in concentration camps has no right to criticize. You didn't have a conscience then. Why do you have a conscience now? Second of all, he said, we couldn't stop Hitler in his bunker in Berlin. Now we're going to stop Arafat in his bunker in Beirut. This was his argument. My teacher, David Hartman, writes an article in the Jerusalem Post. I think it's the best thing he ever wrote, certainly the most clearest thing he ever wrote. It's called Auschwitz or Sinai. This is only a short piece of it. Longer article, but I didn't want to keep you all night. And basically, he asks this question: which is our story? Which story is the governing story of our experience? Auschwitz or Sinai? Should Auschwitz or Sinai be the orienting category shaping our understanding of the rebirth of the state of Israel? It's an interesting thing, by the way. Whenever a diplomat comes to Israel to present credentials to the president, you first go to the president's house and present your credentials, and Then they always take heads of state and new diplomats to Yad Vashem. You go to Yad Vashem, then you can be an ambassador in Israel from another country. And one of the things Hartman is asking, is that the story? Is that really the story we want to tell? Because that story has implications. What story you tell changes the reality you live in. What's the story? In the 20th century, we become a traumatized nation. The ugly demonic forces of anti-Semitism have horrified our sensibilities. We can never forget the destruction of millions of Jews in World War II. And he says, while I respect and share in the anguish, this is controversial. He says, I believe it is destructive to make the Holocaust the dominant organizing category of modern Jewish history and of our national rebirth and renewal. It is politically and morally dangerous for our nation to perceive itself essentially as the suffering remnant of the Holocaust. It is childish and vulgar to attempt to demonstrate how Jewish people's suffering is unique in history, all of which is very common in our parlance. Our bodies have tasted man's indifference and humanity. We have witnessed in our own flesh moral evil present, but this should not tempt us to become morally arrogant. If your argument is, I was a victim and therefore I can do whatever I want and nobody can come and question me, Hartman says, first of all, that violates Jewish law, because in Jewish law, no one can judge who himself is not judged. And the other problem is that our moral sensibilities are then dulled. Because if you say, I'm a victim and I can do whatever I need to do, I can do whatever I want to do, and no one can tell me otherwise, then you're liable to go and do whatever you want to do and not listen to sensitive people, even friends who tell you that's not your best. That's not you. Assuming the cloak of victimhood comes with a very high moral price, says Hartman. And then he says, it's important that we remember, although it is right to appreciate the dignity that comes with power and statehood, with freedom from inconsistent and fragile goodwill of the world, it is a serious mistake to allow the trauma of Jewish suffering to be the exclusive frame for understanding our national renaissance. Israel is not only a response to modern anti-Semitism, so here he's disagreeing with Herzl. It is above all a modern expression of the eternal Sinai covenant that shaped Jewish consciousness throughout the millennium. It was not Hitler who brought us back to Zion, but rather a belief in the internal validity of the Sinai covenant. One need not visit Yad Vashem to understand our love for Jerusalem. It is dangerous to our growth as a healthy people if the memory of Auschwitz becomes a substitute for Sinai. And just incidentally, I don't know how many of you went to my Hebrew school as a kid, but at my Hebrew school as a kid, this time of year, they would show us the movies. Remember the movies, Night and Fog, and there's a whole bunch of movies. And this idea was like these poor teachers couldn't get an emotional response out of American kids, so they'd show us Holocaust movies and make us cry. And Hartman's saying, that's not Judaism. If you can't excite a child by the beauty of living a life of Torah, scaring the hell out of them with awful images of horror, of genocide, is not going to do it either. What you're going to do instead is create someone who has no sensibility for morality altogether and no love for the Jewish people altogether. So here he says, let me give you an alternative. Good Shavuos thought. The model of Sinai awakens the Jewish people to the awesome responsibility of becoming a holy people. At Sinai, we discover the absolute demand of God. We discover who we are by what we do. Sinai calls us to action, to moral awakening, living constantly with the challenge of building a moral and just society which mirrors the kingdom of God in history. Sinai creates humility and openness to the demands of self-transcendence. We're better than that. It's true we have to defend ourselves from horrifying enemies, from vicious enemies, from cruel enemies. But the worst thing to do is to become them. Because the moment we become them, we have violated the principal principal rule of this tradition is don't become Pharaoh. Don't become Haman. Don't become Titus. Don't become Nebuchadnezzar. That's the principal moral rule. Sinai does not tell us the moral purity of the Jewish nation, but the significance of aspiring to live by commandments. Sinai permanently exposes the Jewish people to prophetic aspirations and judgments. Jews were never frightened for the failure to implement covenantal responsibilities. Ben-Gurion had a beautiful statement. He said, "We will know we have a Jewish country when we have Jewish pickpockets and prostitutes." I've been to Tel Aviv. Let me tell you, we got plenty, right? But that's the idea. We can fail. It's okay as long as we continue to aspire. Once we lose the aspiration, once we cloak ourselves in the cloak of victimhood and lose the aspiration, then we've lost something ultimately precious, infinitely precious. Right? Sinai requires that the Jew that he believes in the possibility of integrating moral seriousness of the prophet with the realism and political judgment of the statesman. It was Ahad Ha'am, the great Zionist father, who said that the greatness of Israel will be that we'll have to do all the things that everybody else in the world does, but do them as Jews would do them. For 2,000 years, we said we are moral geniuses. Just read our Talmud. So, okay, good. Now you're back in Israel. Show me what moral genius means in the way that you take care of garbage. And that's also a problem in Israel. Show me moral genius in the way that you distribute health care. Show me moral genius in the way that you conduct war and peace. Show me moral genius in the way that you educate children. Show me moral genius in the way that you deal with the poor and the rich. For Hartman, the glory of Israel is that it allows us to take our moral aspirations that we developed over millennia in diaspora, where we couldn't do anything with them because we had no power, and to make them real. And to make them real. Show me how a Jewish state does all the things everybody else does, but does them better. Does them better. One of my teachers in Israel is a man named Moshe Halbertal, a wonderful philosopher. He's a professor of philosophy at the Hebrew University. He wrote the Code of Military Ethics for the IDF. He actually wrote a code of military ethics. Now, first of all, military ethics is not an oxymoron. There actually is such a thing as military ethics. The rules of engagement, when you use your firearm, how you deal with civilians. And sometimes the Israeli army violates those rules, but there's a deep sense that there is a rule. It's not all's fair in love and war. There is a deep sense of a moral army there. And the world may criticize us, but if you talk to military experts, they'll tell you that there is no more moral army on the planet. If the Israeli army wasn't as moral as they are, Gaza would be a parking lot today. The fact that people actually live there is an indication of the morality of this army, and that's what Hartman's talking about. The rebirth of Israel can be viewed as a return to the fullness of the Sinai covenant, to a Judaism as a way of life. The idea that we can integrate Jewish ethics into all the ways that we live. To all the ways that we live. Here in America, we can do it in lots of ways, but on the outside, we have to live by their rules. In Israel, it's all Jewish law. The traffic cop speaks Hebrew. I could attest to that too, by the way. Try arguing your way out of a ticket. The Jewish world, now this is a funny line to read here, but the Jewish world will have to learn that the synagogue is no longer the exclusive divining framework for Jewish communal life. You know why they're having this big fight in Israel right now? Because if there were, God forbid, a fight on the constitution of the synagogue, that would never happen. But if there were, so people would leave and start another shul. Anyone here ever belong to a synagogue called Anshe Emet? That's always a break-off from a synagogue called Beth El. Right? And then a third synagogue comes along called Beth Shalom, which means we're all back together. It's okay. But if you only have one country, you can't break away. You have to figure these things out. You have to find consensus. And that's what Hartman is saying. Just finish the article. Auschwitz, like all Jewish suffering of the past, must be absorbed and understood within the normative framework of Sinai, and not the other way around. We will mourn forever because of the memory of Auschwitz. We will build a healthy new society because of the memory of Sinai. The question of how we're going to tell our children and our children's children the story of what happened, of who did it, of why it happened, and most of all, the story of what lessons we choose to draw from this experience of Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek. That question, that profound and moral question, is our generation's challenge. And the story of how we're going to build a Jewish state and what the morality of the Jewish people will impinge upon that state and shape it, that is also the greatest question of this generation. And that's one of the conversations we had on those long bus rides between Lublin and Warsaw. Thank you for listening. I think if I asked for questions, we would go all night. Do we have time for questions or not? Yes, no? I'm listening to Alana. One, two questions? All right. Questions, comments? Larry, please. Let me play Vanna White here. Don't I look good in a skirt?
I remember when we were walking the grounds of Majdanek, I kept asking you, why didn't people fight back? What was the appropriate behavior? And I remember in our Wexner class, which you taught, and Yitz Greenberg, I asked him, if we're supposed to be a light unto the nations, what higher percentage should we be than the rest of the people? And he said to me, 10%. We should be 10% better. If we're too much better, we'll get wiped out. If we're not enough better. So do you agree with that?
The first question has to do about fighting back. There was a tremendous amount of fighting back, but under the conditions, look, a Sherman tank pulls up to your front door and points its turret right at your kids. How much fighting back are you planning on doing? I mean, you're dealing with a military machine against a civilian population. What fighting back took place is a miracle. That there were revolts in so many of the concentration camps, that there were revolts in so many of the ghettos, that there were so many rescuers. One of the important points about this is our visit to Yad Vashem. So the Yad Vashem Museum was built in 1961, and then a new Yad Vashem was built 20 years ago? Is it already 20 years? 10 years ago? A few years ago. The difference between the two is remarkable. The old Yad Vashem was a memorial to Shoah Ugvura, to destruction and heroism. And the idea was that the ghetto fighter, the concentration camp rebel, that was resistance, that was strength. As Israel's vision of the Holocaust matured, they came to realize that there were many forms of resistance, some of which was military. But fighting back consisted of many things. Fighting back consisted of the Jewish mother who brought her child to a convent and said, please care for my kid. And the mothers of that convent who took that child in and raised them, and then at the end of the war, returned the kid to the Jewish people. Fighting back consisted of the rabbi who taught bar mitzvah lessons in the Warsaw Ghetto, even though he was starving. Fighting back consisted of those who kept each other alive. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of fighting back under the conditions that one could imagine doing so. That's the first piece of it. The second question is, Yitz Greenberg, who's a wonderful philosopher who's come here many times to teach us, had this idea that the Jewish people learned from the Holocaust to take power in the world. That's why Zionism is not a rebellion against Jewish history, but it's the fulfillment of Jewish history. But now the question is, how do you integrate Jewish ethics with the real politic of living? And of course, the problem is multiplied infinitely by the fact that God put us in the worst neighborhood in the world. I think I've told you before, don't go to Maui. Don't go to Maui. You'll become an atheist like me. I stood on the top of Maui Mountain, looked at this beautiful, clear blue water, beautiful white sand beach, beautiful passive people. I turned my eyes toward heaven and I said, Rebbeinu Shalom, master of the world, you knew about this place? And you put us where? I mean, what would have been so bad? You'd have Oahu and Lanai and Kauai and a Jewish island called Alavai. And we would have lived there. You know, we would have learned how to do chula. You know, we'd make kosher pao, poi, whatever they call it, gewalt. You know, luau sounds almost like Hebrew. Luau, luauti, luaunu, right? Would have been so terrible. Like, put us in the middle of nowhere with people who don't mind. You know, why do you put us in the worst place in the world? You put the Jewish people. I mean, if there's a sense of cunning in history or irony in God's mind, to put this people that always said, we will conduct ourselves a few points better than the rest of the world, you put them in the world's worst neighborhood. It's okay, let's see how you do. Let's see how you do. We know how the Russians dealt with the Chechens. We know how the Afghans deal with each other, right? We know how the Americans dealt with their native population. Let's see how you Jews do. So Gitz Greenberg said 10% better. I'm not sure. I don't know how many percent. How many percent better can we be without getting killed? As many, that to me is the limit. Survival is a value, and ethics are a value. Now figure out that dialectic. That's what my friend Moshe Halber told us. I wouldn't say 10%. I'd like 100%. But I don't know if the world will let you have 100%, because it's a pretty nasty world. Maybe 50%, maybe 20%, maybe in each particular area. The most poignant statement we heard the whole trip was a speech given by the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, at the ceremony in Birkenau. And he said, you know what the irony is? Jews are very good at dying together. We just don't know how to live together. That stuck with me. I don't know if it stuck with you, right? So here's what I would say. Maybe 10% better, 20% better with the... How about 100% better with the way we treat each other? How about we learn some gentleness in treating each other, and some care with treating each other, and some kindness and some pluralism with how we treat each other. That, I think, is long in coming in the Jewish story. That's a long sermon smushed into a small answer, because the cheesecake is warming up or cooling off.
Questions for now.
Cut off.
No. Cut off. But you have people who want to sing. You need a mic?
Shakoach. A quick musical break, an excerpt of a song in Ladino, followed by a song that we all know, Al Kol Eile by Naomi Shemer, and the words of Hitora Lanu are here on the projector, and they actually express that joy of Sinai that Rabbi Professor Hartman was talking about, that joy of being at Sinai, and focuses on that beautiful moment. And Naomi Shemer focuses on, this is almost as though it was directly linked to what Rabbi Feinstein was saying. Oh God of goodness, don't uproot the planted, don't forget the hope. Turn me to you, I will return to the good land. So God, please guard over the bitter and the sweet. They are a part of our lives. It's a part of everything, our history, our memory, but please turn us toward hope.
Moving Yasher Koach, beautiful. We've all been sitting for a long time, so like at study sessions in Jerusalem that go all night long, why don't we stand up for just a moment just to get some blood flowing? Okay? Right. A 4-page packet is going around. I think there should be enough. If not, if you know the person next to you, feel free to share with the person next to you. You may be seated. It even works now, you see. So tonight I was supposed to tell the story about the modern miracle that is our homeland, the state of Israel. And tonight's talk could have very easily been called Between Two Flags. Has anybody ever seen the comedy series Between Two Ferns? Thank you, Cantor Raffi, thank you. It's a comedy series done by Zach Galifianakis where he interviews people and makes fun of them and makes fun of himself. And people have participated from Brad Pitt to President Obama. People come and allow him to ridicule them, and they ridicule him back, and they shoot zingers at each other. But they sit on a set that is absolutely the poorest, worst decorated set, but there's 2 cheap fern plants that are standing there between on the outside of 2 chairs, and the show is called Between Two Ferns. There's a movie. Thank you, Sam. There's a movie, too. Most of our synagogue life occurs between 2 flags. We open the ark, and we stand between 2 flags. Cantor Raffi, Cantor Barron, Cantor Fox, Rabbi Feinstein, myself, we stand here, and you stare at us standing, from your perspective, always between 2 flags. And for the last several months, when I've spoken about the narrative that's Israel, I've spoken about the state of Israel from the perspective of Israel. When I talk about Israel as the modern day story of the Maccabees, most of us aren't in that story. I hate to break it to you, but we live in Encino, right? Michelle's parents, some of our parents, some of our family, they were in the story. I told you, Papa Nathan's daughter left to make Aliyah. She took one of the Exodus ships. She and her family and their descendants are in the story. We came to Chicago. And so our perspective of Israel, my relationship with Israel is very different. So for months and months, we've celebrated Israel and its 75th birthday. And we've told the story about Israel. I talked about Shimon Peres. And I interviewed an author by the name of Rick Richmond, who wrote an outstanding book about 8 heroes in Israel's story. All of the stories are about people born outside of the land of Israel who move into the land of Israel to help create or recreate the modern day state. But we, sitting here today, live here in Encino. And so how do we begin to discuss the diaspora, the state in which we live? How do we begin to talk about that? And I believe, especially on Shavuot, we should probably begin considering our narrative as diaspora Jews by looking at the Torah. I was once sitting in Alan Dershowitz's office at Harvard Law School, talking to him, and he told me that no matter what organization asks him to speak, and talking to Alan Dershowitz, he likes to tell you that there are many, many organizations who ask him to speak. He always looks at the Parsha first. Because what's going on in the Parsha is what is on people's minds. Jewish organizations, non-Jewish organizations, he always begins in the Parsha. I have to tell you something, just this is an aside story. Alan Dershowitz is probably the most polished speaker I've ever been around in my life, hands down. I've been around politicians, I've been around whatever, Alan Dershowitz. So when I started interviewing him for the documentary Roadmap Genesis, I sat down in his office and he said to me, do you want my answers in 2-minute, 3-minute, or 4-minute bites? And to that point, nobody had asked me that question before, and I said, let's try for 3 minutes. And he said, 3 minutes? Okay, great. His answers, each answer was 2 minutes and 59 seconds, and some nanoseconds after that, always cut off in the editing suite immediately before 3 minutes hit, immediately. Perfectly timed. Pregnant pauses, dramatic, everything. Perfectly timed for 3-minute bites. So then we would change we had to reboot the camera every 10 minutes because in those days, those DSLRs that we would carry, that was the formatting issue, and we would start a new file. So in between one of these little breaks that we had, it would take us about 2-3 minutes to do that. He said to me, Rabbi, do me a favor. I once wrote a midrash on Benjamin in Genesis, because of course the whole documentary is about Genesis. Do me a favor, ask me, and as part of your next question, about the midrash, about Benjamin, and we'll start from there. I said, great. So we're rolling, and I said, Mr. Dershowitz, can you tell me a little bit about the midrash that you wrote? And he said to me, Rabbi, I'm so flattered that a rabbi of your stature has read my midrash. I'm embarrassed. And I knew in that moment that everything I had to learn as a speaker was sitting in front of me right there behind the desk, and so this is the best I could do, but he was amazing. And I was sitting there, and he would tell me, every time you want to start a story, anytime you want to start a speech, anytime you want to begin an idea, you can find the thread of it in the Torah, because everything is derivative from the Torah and the Tanakh at large. And he's been right. Our story about our living in the diaspora begins in Numbers 32, right here on the page. The Torah tells us, Umikne Rav haya livnei Reuven v'livnei Gad atzum me'od. The Reubenites and the Gadites owned cattle in very great numbers. But actually, it says great twice in the sentence. The sentence could say umikne without the word Rav, haya livnei Reuven v'livnei Gad, atzum me'od, very great. It didn't need to say Rav and atzum ma'ad. What the Torah is trying to tell us is that these people are rich. That even while wandering in the wilderness, there were Jews who had money and there were Jews who didn't have money. These Jews, the story about these Jews are about Jews who had stuff, a lot of stuff. Noting that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were a region suitable for cattle, the Gadite and the Reubenite leaders came to Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains of the community, and said, Ataro, Dibon, Yazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Elah, Sabon, Nebon, and Beon, the land that God conquered for the community of Israel through the battle of Og and Sichon and Og that just occurred, is cattle country, and your servants have cattle. It would be a favor to us if this land were given to your servants as a holding. Do not move us across the Jordan. What are they saying to Moses? Think of the chutzpah of these people. They've been wandering for 40 years together with the stated goal that they all go into Israel and celebrate, get to live in the land of Eretz Zvat Chalav Udvash, a land flowing with milk and honey. And upon reaching the Jordan River, they say, do you know what? The school systems and the restaurants and our jobs and the sports teams here on this side of the Jordan, we like this life. This is good for us. We don't need to go in. You know how annoying it'll be if we have to get electrical adapters everywhere we go on the other side of the Jordan? We don't want to do that. We want to stay here where our electrical adapters work. My God, the most advanced country in the world, and they can't figure out how to use those three-prong adapters. It's an unbelievable thing. They walk up to Moses and they say, we're very successful here. We don't want to try our luck. Moses, parenthetically, I'll tell you, he had steam coming out of his ears. He replied to the Gadites and the Reubenites, saying, are your brothers to go to war while you stay here? Why will you turn the minds of the Israelites from crossing into the land that God has given them? Think about it. That's what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to survey the land. Does everybody remember Moses sent in the spies? And the spies came back, 10 out of the 12. 10 out of the 12 came back and said that the land was no good. The land was dangerous. It was filled with giants. We shouldn't dare go in. God said, you know what? These people need to think about what they just said. They should walk in circles for 40 years until they die. Everybody in the entire community has been walking in circles for 40 years because of the foolishness of 10 people. 10 people. Those 10 people, by the way, are called an Edah. They're called a community. And because of that, in Edah, we understand a community is established by 10 people, which is why a minyan is established by 10 people because of those 10 yokels. And if you look at the text, they identify themselves in the paragraph before, Ha'aretz asher hika Adonai, that the land that God has struck the inhabitants, lifnei, before us, they call themselves Adat Yisrael. The text is telling us they are in the tradition. They stand in the tradition of those 10 that came before them a generation earlier that says, we don't need to go in. This is just fine. We have a good view from right here. We have a good view. I always think about that. If you're on a bus ride from Jerusalem to Masada and the Dead Sea, you're on a bus ride and you're going down south, and without a doubt, the tour guide will say, if you look out the window over here, you can see Har Nevo, which is exactly where Moses stood, and he looked over the Jordan River and saw in, and people always say, is it that mountain, is it that mountain, is it that mountain? And the tour guide says, yes, whichever, yes, that's exactly right. Yes, take a picture. Yes, that's exactly right? I always wonder on the bus ride on the Jordanian side when they're going down to the Dead Sea, right? And they say, look on the other side, right? That's what Moses saw. It's very funny. I always think of the other bus rides going down on the other side. That's where Reuven, Gad, and Menashe were on the bus rides on the other side. They thought it was just fine to go on the Dead Sea on the other side. There was no need. Moses says, we've seen this movie. It didn't end well for us. God was incensed and swore, none of the men from 20 years up who came out of Egypt shall see the land that I promised as an oath. to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they did not remain loyal to me. None except Caleb and Joshua, for they remained loyal to me. Joshua ends up being the leader of Israel, and Caleb is promised a city of his own, right? He becomes the first mayor of Hebron. Okay, he takes over the city of Hebron. God incensed at Israel and made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the whole generation that had provoked God's displeasure was gone. And now you, a breed of sinful fellows, have replaced your fathers to add still further to God's wrath against Israel. If you turn away from God, who then abandons them once more in the wilderness? You will bring calamity upon all the people. The mistake you're about to make, Moses says to them, I'm 120 years old. I can't walk around with you anymore in circles. I wish I could stick around and watch you make this mistake, but I just can't. So I have to tell you, you can't make this mistake. You just can't do it. On page 2, they stepped up to him and said, they really wanted to stay in the diaspora. We'll build here sheepfolds for our flocks and towns for our children. And we'll hasten as troops in the van of the Israelites until we have established them in their home, while our children stay in the fortified towns because of the inhabitants of the land. We'll help, but our children will stay in safe cities. We'll send our adult men in to fight with you, but our wives and our children, they'll stay here across the river. We like the school districts. We like Starbucks. We will not return to our homes until the Israelites, every one of them, are in possession of their portion. And suddenly, in that sentence, we see the result of this deal. The deal is that Reuven, Gad, and Manasseh begin to call the Israelites the other people. They're no longer part of the group that's known as Bnei Yisrael. Ad hitnachal Bnei Yisrael ish nachlato. Until the children of Israel each acquire their own inheritance. And then, once the children of Israel have gotten what's theirs, then we'll come back across the Jordan to live where we want to live. But we'll not have a share with them in the territory beyond the Jordan, for we've received our share on the east side of the Jordan. Moses said to them, if you do this, if you go to battle at the insistence of God, and every fighter among you crosses the Jordan at the insistence of God, until God has personally dispossessed the enemies and the land has been subdued at the insistence of God, and then you return, you shall be clear before God and before Israel, and this land shall be your holding under God. How does Moses respond? It's a deal. He spits in his hand, and he offers his hand. They spit in their hand, and they shake. And the diaspora is born. And what is the deal of the diaspora? What do we have to hold up on our end, according to Moses? When Israel needs our support, we show up. That's the whole deal. The whole deal is that when Israel needs our support, needs our help, when Israel has a fight, that we become part of the fight. We don't stand on the sidelines and watch as spectators, as Jewish brothers and sisters go to fight battles on behalf of the Jewish people. Because if we don't understand it, Moses is explaining, you're part of the fight. Just because you live on the other side of the Jordan doesn't mean that you're no longer part of the epic narrative of the Jewish people. You're part of the epic narrative. But I don't care what community you live in Jordan, you have to understand that the Jews living on the west side of the Jordan are living where they're supposed to. And it's your obligation to help them. And it's their obligation to live there, get helped when they need it. Right? They are fulfilling the covenant in this way. So you think to yourself, in this dynamic, the Jews in the diaspora are fighters. To fulfill the obligation, what else can we do but fight? Right? If anybody understands it differently, Nowhere does Moses say, when Israel needs you, make a donation to Magen David Adom, and then Magen David Adom will use your dollars to the best of their knowledge to put it in the right areas because Israelis are getting hurt, and therefore you will do your best and from the comfort of your home in Encino. That's not what Moses says. So Moses must think that we as diaspora Jews, as diaspora Zionists, we have the muscle to fight. So I began to think, after studying this text over and over, then where is it in Jewish history where we start to understand ourselves as not being able to fight? Right? To the end of the Tanakh, we're fighters. And then somewhere along the lines, this man comes along named David Ben-Gurion who says, from the Tanakh to the Palmach, that's our story, everything in the middle is a giant mistake. Giant mistake. Just ignore it. Ignore 2,000 years of history because it was a detour in the wrong direction. All right? The Starbucks is a detour. We're supposed to all be at Aroma Cafe. So I started to do research. So there's a lot. There's a lot in the Talmud. There's a lot in Hasidic texts in terms of praying for deliverance. And you can say from this, Jews don't know how to fight. But that's not really where we get our modern understanding of the way that Jewish history has unfolded. The way we get our understanding of the way that Jewish history has unfolded is actually through Jewish history. And modern Jewish historians have taken history of the Jewish people and crafted it for us to see it the way they want to see it. So, in 1888, in Germany, a boy was born by the name of Fritz Baer. Fritz Baer studied at Berlin University and studied at all of the great academic institutions in Germany at the time. And then after suffering from anti-Semitism his whole life, in 1930, he makes Aliyah as part of the end of the second wave of Aliyah. And he becomes a professor of history at Hebrew University, where he eventually becomes the chairperson of the department. And in 1936, he writes a book called Galut. This book changes the way we understand the Jewish experience in diaspora. And just like when I say that Herzl wrote the Jewish state, changed the world, you expect that I'm going to pick up a book the size of, the Talmud. You pick up a little pamphlet. This little idea changed the world. So this is the book. This is the entirety of the book that he wrote called Galut. All right? This describes all of 2,000 years of Jewish history. Here in my hands I hold it, right? This is what we descend from this Gullus here. And upon arriving to Israel, he changed his name to Yitzchak Fritz Baer. He adopted his Hebrew name as his first name. This is the very first paragraph of the book. The word Galut embraces a whole world of facts and ideas that have appeared with varying strength and clarity in every age of Jewish history. Everybody has had to face Galut. Galut is bigger than a place, according to Fritz Baer. Galut is not a place. Galut is a state of being. Political servitude and dispersion, the longing for liberation and reunion, sin and repentance and atonement, these are the larger elements that must go to make up the concept of Galut, if the word is to retain any real meaning. Galut is so heavy with so many different concepts. How could a Jew physically stand in a diaspora? If this is what we walk around with on a regular basis, with political servitude and dispersion, longing for liberation and reunion, sin and repentance and atonement, this is what we carry with us as baggage. How could we possibly be strong? How could we possibly be strong? We're weighed down by this each and every day. The book ends, and I'll just read you a paragraph from the very last page. We went among the nations, neither to exploit them nor to help them build their civilizations. All that we did on foreign soil was a betrayal of our own spirit. Nor, finally, did we go among the nations of Europe in order to convert them in the sense of that missionary ardor which animated our people in antiquity and which later animated the followers of Christianity. Once political limitations had destroyed the possibilities of conversion, our people had to content itself with testifying to its missionary vocation in the world by its mere existence. The point of Jewish existence in the diaspora, according to Professor Baer, is simply survival. He comes along as exactly part of the same generation of Ben-Gurion, exactly part of the same generation of Yechezkel Kaufman, who also ended up at Hebrew University to found a Bible department that ended up defining the Bible as entirely a Jewish document. Fritz Baer comes along and becomes Yitzhak Fritz Baer and looks back at Germany and says, those Jews are getting it all wrong. They're getting it all wrong. And we today carry that narrative forward. This little book changes the way that we understand Jewish history. The next document I want to show you, by the way, I learned this book when I was studying for my qualifying exams for my PhD on Jewish nationalism. This is one of the books that I had to study about the diasporic experience. And when I tell you quite literally, right, Fritz Baer, Yitzhak Fritz Baer, Professor Baer, this idea, once he lays it down, becomes the doctrine for every Israeli historian that follows him. Every Israeli historian that follows him and European historians within the next decade or 2 decades all adopt the narrative that Jews who move to Israel are going to become physically strong again. Jews that live in diaspora aren't interested in that kind of strength. I taught it in Rav Kook's class too, by the way, for those of you who joined my class with Rav Kook. Rav Kook said, an orange can grow anywhere in the world. It's true, we've all seen it. But oranges are only supposed to grow in one place. Florida, right? Anybody who's ever tasted a tomato in Israel comes back to the United States and says, why don't tomatoes and cucumbers taste like this, right? Why doesn't milk and honey, why doesn't food taste like this? So people noticed from a long time ago, the same generation, Rav Kook, Professor Baer, Professor Kaufman, Ben-Gurion, all these people were thinking the same exact thing. I want to take a jump forward now and actually begin our trek in the diaspora. We're going to keep jumping back between the diaspora and Israel to understand the relationship. This is a letter written by a gentleman by the name of Jacob Blaustein. Jacob Blaustein is probably the most important American Jew that most of you have never heard of. Jacob Blaustein was born in 1892, and in the year of 1910, he's 18 years old. He founds Amica Oil with his father and immediately becomes a tycoon at 18. Okay? Only a few years later, you have to understand, a few years later, we're in the 1920s, he buys another company, he invests in Standard Oil and builds a partnership by investing $5 million into that company in the 1920s. He's 30 years old. 30 years old. Jacob Blaustein. Jacob Blaustein went on to spearhead Holocaust reparations after the Shoah for the survivors that were showing up here and around the world. And he became the president of the AJC, which we're going to talk about, the American Jewish Committee. And he became a personal advisor to President Roosevelt, President Truman, President Kennedy. President Eisenhower asked him to represent this country at the United Nations. In its founding, he was there in San Francisco. Then they decided parking was too good for the UN, so they put it in the middle of Manhattan, right? And then Jacob Blaustein began turning his attention to the state of Israel. And this is where he becomes the most controversial version of himself. So first I'll read you a little bit about Jacob Blaustein in his own words, and then I'll read you a little bit about what Danny Gordis thinks of Jacob Blaustein in his book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. This is a letter that he wrote to the members of the AJC, right? So just like our email blasts that come out every single week, this is a letter to the membership that happened at the end of the year about the upcoming year. And by the way, it's fascinating to go through different historical societies through the country to find these documents. Just like I found the document of the AJC here, I found the document of President Kennedy's speech that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, and moved along from all, and I'll read you President Truman's statement in a couple of minutes as well. This is in 1950. In this time of national crisis, it is imperative that we forthrightly consider the American Jewish Committee's program for 1951. What was happening in 1951? In Jewish history, nothing was happening in 1951. A lot happened in 1939 to 1945. 1948, the whole Jewish world changed. And if you're in school learning about Jewish history, you jump from 1948 to 1956 or 1967. There's nothing that happens to the Jewish community between that. In the middle, somebody might pause to talk about Sandy Koufax, but that's about it. That's about it. What's happening in 1951, according to the Jewish world and our narrative, is Israel. And Jacob Blaustein, the most powerful Jew in the country, says it's imperative that we forthrightly consider the American Jewish Committee's program for 1951. That we together sharpen and define our objectives and our plans and realistically relate them to the world in which we live today. There'll be many problems and issues before us. On the international scene, we must consider the impact of recent and emerging world events upon major facets of our program. And of course, if you're reading this letter, you think, he's going to turn right away to Israel. It's 1950. It's 2 years after the miracle was born. And he says in this order, developments within Germany, prospects for the implementation of human rights guarantees within the framework of the United Nations, Arab-Israel tensions. And he's not talking about supporting Israel necessarily. He's talking about Arab-Israel tensions as how that'll affect the American Jewish community. So here, I have Danny Gordis' book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. I make every single student that goes through the Intro to Judaism class read this book to learn about Israel. Danny owes me quite a bit of residual money. So here is surprisingly, at least to Ben-Gurion, there was one major Jewish community virtually unaffected by the veritable miracle of the fulfillment of the ancient vision of the ingathering of all the exiles. As hundreds of thousands of Jews were streaming to Israel from Europe and Arab communities from which they had been banished, fewer than 2,000 came from the United States, which had a Jewish population of over 5 million. Ben-Gurion, an ideologue to the very core, was disgusted. Years after Israel's creation, Ben-Gurion recalled this with some bitterness. And then Ben-Gurion says a lot of insulting things about American Jews. And then I'll skip along to a part where the American Jewish Committee, perhaps the most important and powerful American Jewish communal institution at the time, did not reject the idea of a Jewish state and would certainly not act against it, but neither was it willing to grant to Israel the role of the center of the Jewish world. Even Jacob Blaustein, president of the American Jewish Committee, told his membership that when the AJC agreed to support the 1947 partition plan, that was largely because a Jewish state would solve a demographic problem for the Jewish people. We had cooperated in the approval of partition, he said, in the conviction that a Jewish state was the only practical solution for some hundreds of thousands of surviving Jews in Europe. According to Jacob Blaustein, Israel is nothing but it's a refugee camp. That's exactly right. It's a refugee camp. And it's our obligation to those Jews to make sure that they have a place to go. But it's certainly not anything more than an obligation for us to be there to help them. And when I kept studying about Jacob Blaustein, you get very quickly to this document that I'd never read before, the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion Agreement which is perhaps the most shocking article I've read in a long time, where the author, this comes out of the Maryland Jewish Historical Society. I believe that's what it's called. On August 23rd, 1950, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion attended a luncheon in his honor in Jerusalem where he exchanged remarks with the Baltimore businessman and community leader Jacob Blaustein. This was no mere conversation. The Israeli cabinet was present, and Ben-Gurion's comments had President Chaim Weizmann's prior approval. Developed over many months and during a series of meetings, the historic exchange attempted to establish a framework for what would become Israeli diaspora relationship, employable for this foreseeable future. During the conversation, Ben-Gurion and Blaustein praised the accomplishments of each other's Jewish community, although Blaustein pointedly commented about some statements of Israeli officials that implied that all Jews should return to Israel from exile in the diaspora, since life for Jews outside the Jewish homeland was tenuous and incomplete at best. These statements, said Blaustein, undercut the security and morale of American Jews. Both men then agreed that American Jews would lobby, donate, and raise money for the new nation without ever meddling in Israeli policies and politics for Israel. For its part, recognized the allegiance of American Jews to the United States. It too would not meddle in the internal affairs of diaspora Jewry. Individuals who chose to make Aliyah were needed and would be warmly welcomed, but those remaining in America would not be disparaged anymore as exiles. Neither American nor Israeli Jews would speak in behalf of one another any longer. This type of agreement would cause absolute uproar today. People are shaking their heads in the crowd as I look around. Just imagine David Ben-Gurion and what he accomplished for Jewish history and the Jewish people, sitting there negotiating how he speaks about the Jewish people with Jacob Blaustein, who had accomplished a great deal, both financially and for the Jewish people in terms of reparations and in a lot of other matters. But simply put, he gets it wrong. And he gets it wrong on Israel because if you read the statements by other people, they're all classifying Israel as a refugee camp. This is a statement by President Truman following the adjournment of the Palestine Conference in London in 1946. Okay, this is after they closed the door and they say we can't come to a deal. President Truman says, I have learned with deep regret that the meetings of the Palestine Conference in London have been adjourned and are not resumed until December 16, 1946. In light of this situation, it's appropriate to examine the record of the administration's effort in its field, efforts which have been supported in and out of Congress by members of both political parties, and my state, my views on the situation as it now exists. I'm going to jump all the way down. I have nevertheless maintained my deep interest in the matter and have repeatedly made known and have urged that steps be taken at the earliest possible moment to admit 100,000 Jewish refugees to Palestine immediately. To President Truman, Israel was a refugee camp. Israel was a refugee camp. And I read dozens of Truman speeches. And my grandparents thought Truman was a hero. And he was for voting the way that he did. Because there's no way that anybody could have imagined that he would vote the way that he did. And yet, he doesn't view Israel as anything more than a refugee camp. So how does the idea begin to change? What happens in American Jews that allows us to stand up and once again be strong? Everyone has always told me that had you only been there in 1967, you would have seen a change in the current. And I have to tell you, if you read speeches and documents, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true. It might have been true for Jews, but it wasn't true for America or the rest of the world. America, like its founders, supported Israel before the Jewish community supported Israel. Ben-Gurion looks at the Bible. This is David Ben-Gurion's words in 1959. You have to imagine, he made an agreement with Jacob Blaustein that he was supposed to honor. And this is from a book that I have upstairs in my office, an amazing book called Ben-Gurion Looks at the Bible. It's a bunch of speeches that he gave where he references the Tanakh. Everyone calls Ben-Gurion secular, Shimon Peres secular. We only hope and pray that the children in our religious school come out as secular as Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres, okay? That they can quote the Tanakh as well as they did. We know about the divisions of countries. The country of Alexander the Great was divided after his death. The Swedes and Norwegians were together. The Norwegians said, we want a separate state. But our question is, how can a nation that was born together, that lived together, that suffered together, that was redeemed together, that received the Torah together, that saw signs and miracles together, that conquered together, how after all this was it divided into tribes? That's the question, and no answer is given to it. Ben-Gurion reads the same chapter of Numbers 32 and wonders the same thing that I do. If diaspora is such a good deal, how did it possibly happen? How is it that in every generation there are Jews who say, this is great. This is great. I'll show up when Israel's in trouble. And I really like VBS day school for my kids. Right? I really like living here. I like Encino Little League. And Ben-Gurion wouldn't dare say this to Jews, so he gives these speeches to Israelis where he talks about the Tanakh, and then they get published all around the world because he's giving these speeches, and they get put together into a compendium and published here in America in 1959. Blaustein must have been thrilled. Arthur Hertzberg writes in the same year, in 1959, the bulk of the growing Zionist body in the West, especially in America, were not true Westerners. According to Hertzberg, if you read his introduction, if you were a Zionist in America at the outset of Israel, you were not a real American. This is written by an American rabbi. They were, as Weitzman remarked in another occasion, East Europeans. They were Europeans who had come across. They were not Americans. Kneaded from the same dough as himself, as Chaim Weitzman, who brought their Zionist emotions with them as they joined the stream of migration. Solomon Schechter, a Romanian Jew who had come by way of faculty post at Cambridge to head the JTS in New York, understood these people best of all. His announcement in 1906 in America that he adhered to Zionism was an event of major import, in part because everyone knew that this national movement was strongly opposed by the very men uptown, Jacob Schiff and Felix Warburg, among others, who had called him to the United States. These wealthy other Jacob Blausteins brought Solomon Schechter here to be the chairperson of JTS. They had no interest in him speaking about the Jewish relationship to Israel because it would complicate our American narrative and our lives here as Jews. But Solomon Schechter did it, and according to Arthur Hertzberg, the only way to explain it is that he wasn't born American. He wasn't really American. He still brought his Romanian roots across. So how is it the generation of American Jews actually grew up with the permission to support Israel? Every time I read President Kennedy, I have to cry. Every time I read President Washington, President Lincoln, President Kennedy, President Reagan, I wonder why Americans don't speak like that anymore. But here we are, and we're going to read a speech by Senator Kennedy that he delivered in New York in 1960, before he was president. This is before the Six-Day War, for those of us who don't know the history dates, before the Six-Day War. And President Kennedy delivers this speech to the Zionists of America Convention. Israel became a triumphant and enduring reality exactly 50 years after Theodore Herzl. I believe that sentence was said by me here in this room with the VBS Day School Yom HaAtzmaut celebration, and I think Rabbi Feinstein said a sentence almost exactly like that at the gala. The prophet of Zionism had proclaimed the ideal of nationhood. It was the classic case of an ancient dream finding a young leader, right? Kennedy was pretty young in this time as well, so he draws a lot of parallels about how good young leaders are. For Herzl was then only 37 years of age. Perhaps I may be allowed the observation that the Jewish people, ever since David slew Goliath, have never considered youth as a barrier to leadership, right? I like Jews because you like young people, and I'm young. Vote for Kennedy. Or measured experience and maturity by mere length of days. I first saw Palestine in 1939, and now we hear President Kennedy speaking words I'm sure somebody here is going to go Google tonight instead of studying Torah when they go home, and you're going to look for a presidential speech before this. I was not able to find one. If you do, Yasher Koach. I first saw Palestine in 1939. There, the neglect and ruin left by centuries of Ottoman misrule were slowly being transformed by miracles of labor and sacrifice. What is President Kennedy acknowledging here? He's acknowledging the Jews were transforming Israel long before the end of the Shoah. If he was standing there in 1939 and saw Jews working the land, then the narrative of the Shoah ends and the Exodus boats, and then hundreds of thousands of Jews show up and are dropped in as colonialists is not true. And President Kennedy says it. I returned in 1951 to see the grandeur of Israel. In 3 years, this new state had opened its doors to 600,000 immigrants and refugees. And that's to expect because Israel is, according to the United States, Jews and non-Jews, it's a refugee camp. Even while fighting for its own survival, Israel had given new hope to the persecuted and new dignity to the pattern of Jewish life. I left with the conviction that the United Nations may have conferred upon Israel the credentials of nationhood, but its own idealism and courage, its own sacrifice and generosity had earned it the credentials of immortality. Who speaks like this today? Nobody, unfortunately. Israel earned its own right to exist. It's not a refugee camp. There were people there working the land, making miracles happen long before 1948, and President Kennedy saw it with his own eyes. Time will judge whether Israel will continue to exist, but I wish I could be as sure of all of my prophecies as I am of my flat prediction that Israel is here to stay. For Israel was not created in order to disappear. Israel will endure and flourish. Now he's speaking to Jews. Keep that in mind. He's speaking to a room full of Jews. It is the child of hope and the home of the brave. What's the home of the brave? America is the home of the brave. What does he say? He says Israel is the home of the brave. It can neither be broken by adversity nor demoralized by success. It carries the shield of democracy and it honors the sword of freedom. And no area of the world has ever had an overabundance of democracy and freedom. In 1960, there should not have been a single Jew who did not support President Kennedy. I'll say that from the Bema right now. Reading this speech, I don't know who he was running against at that moment in 1960 in New York, who the opposition was. I don't know if it was, this was an early presidential. I tried to figure it out in terms of what this was. Was this a fundraiser for him as senator? Was this early presidential run? I'm not exactly sure, but the entire Jewish room should have been standing and applauding, and because I know Jews, I very much doubt it. But they should have been standing and applauding. It is worth remembering, too, that Israel is a cause that stands beyond the ordinary changes and chances of American public life. In our pluralistic society, it has not been a Jewish cause any more than Irish independence was solely the concern of Americans of Irish descent. The ideals of Zionism have, in the last half century, been repeatedly endorsed by presidents and members of Congress from both parties. Friendship for Israel is not a partisan matter. It is a national commitment. You could start to cry. You could start to cry. Who gives the American Jewish community permission to stand up and be strong? Presidents of the United States. America gives American Jews permission to stand up and be strong. Waves of Israelis come. Jewish leaders come from all around the world. Ben-Gurion came here and spoke, right? If you read Rick Richmond's first book, right? Ben-Gurion came here to speak. Chaim Weizmann came here to speak. Jabotinsky came here to speak. They didn't convince anybody that it was a worthwhile cause to stand up and fight. President Kennedy is saying to the Jewish community, there's no reason for you to shah still any longer. I've seen what Jews can be. I've been to the home of the brave. You think this is the home of the brave. I've seen how brave you have to be to live in that neighborhood. Stand up and be proud. Stand up and be proud. The Jewish community changes sometime in the 60s, and we attribute it to the Six-Day War, that Israel inspires the American Jewish community to stand up. Israel might convince the American Jewish community to stand up after years of American leaders encouraging us that it's okay. It's okay to stand up and be strong again. We're supposed to be Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh. That's the deal we made. And when we're not, Bible-believing Christians don't understand why we're not. And we point today to the South, the evangelical community, and say, they support Israel, they want us to be something different, we don't want to be that, this, that, and the other. This has been a long discussion in America. This is a long dialectic in terms of how Christians understand Israel, how Christians understand American Jews, how American Jews understand Israel, and how American Jews understand American Jews. And I could draw a Talmudic chart right here behind me for us to understand what I just said, to understand that there are 4 different boxes on that chart and 4 different perspectives of how we should behave. Danny Gordis, in his conclusion of his book, writes that the Zionist movement had made the Jewish people a variety of promises. There are so many narratives we could tell. We could tell the narrative of Schulweis, the narrative of Heschel, the narrative of Hartman. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We could tell the narrative of Ben-Gurion. We could tell the narrative of Jacob Blaustein. We could tell the narrative of President Kennedy. Some had come to fruition, others had not. In the Jewish state, Theodor Herzl asserted that if the Jews had a state of their own, anti-Semitism in Europe would wither. That prediction had proven sadly naive. European anti-Semitism is growing at an alarming rate. French Jews are fleeing Europe, and all across the continent, Jews are watching anti-Semitic parties on both the radical left and the fascist right with increased wariness. In ways that Herzl would not have anticipated, the Jewish state has had a profound effect on the Jews of the diaspora. Today, if we ask Jews, what is our relationship to Israel? I think most Jews in the mainstream, this played out by the Pew Report, most Jews in the mainstream believe that we have an obligation to support it. And we think that that began with the founding of the State of Israel, but I'm showing you through documentation it did not. It did not. It's 50 years old at best. At a 75-year birthday for Israel, American Jewish support is 50 years old at most. When we ask, who is the child in this relationship? Israel's been around for 75 years, and for nations of the world, that makes it an infant. And American Jewish support for Israel is even younger. As we begin to understand our relationship with one another, we're both trying to find our feet. In ways that Herzl would not have anticipated, the Jewish state has had a profound effect on the Jews of the diaspora. Though Judaism is about much more than Israel, it is Israel that galvanizes diaspora Jews more than any other issue. And if you think about it, during my interview process here at VBS, I was asked about 100,000 times what I thought about Israel, and I was never once asked if I believe in God. Never once. I was never once asked how the Torah came to be. Never once. It is only Israel that get Jews across the globe to join rallies and marches in huge numbers. Most other dimensions of Jewish life have been relegated to the realm of the private, and between denominations, differences in practice are so wide that varying Jewish communities often have little common ground. Where they do come together, and where Judaism leaves the private sphere and enters the public square, is when diaspora Jews think about and argue about what is happening in the Jewish state in ways that Jacob Blaustein could not have anticipated. American Jews agree with him that they are not in exile, yet somehow Israel captures their attention and concern in ways that no other Jewish issue does. So Herzl was not entirely wrong. The Jewish state has indeed transformed Jewish life in the diaspora. So I'm going to leave on a trip on June 19th. I've become part of the leadership of a group called the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition. It's a group of Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbis. And we're traveling, there are 14 of us that are going to travel from the United States to the United Arab Emirates. We're going to spend 3 nights in the United Arab Emirates. Then we're going to travel to Bahrain, and we're going to spend 3 nights in Bahrain. And then we're traveling to Israel, and we'll spend 3 nights in Israel. So I have to tell you a funny story just before I end, and that is we're all on a Zoom call together, and they say, great news, guys. The United Arab Emirates has offered to pay for everybody to fly business class from the United States to the United Arab Emirates. And the whole Zoom call, oh my gosh, that's fantastic. They say, and the United Arab Emirates is going to put you up in Dubai in the St. Regis, oh my God, St. Regis. And the United Arab Emirates is going to put you up in the Ritz-Carlton in Abu Dhabi. Oh, and they're paying for business class to Emirates, to Bahrain. Oh, fantastic. And Bahrain is putting you up in this class. Terrific. And they're flying you business class to Israel. That's great. And Israel is paying for garnished. What does Israel want with 14 more rabbis? So, when we get to Israel, the first night, the 14 of us are having dinner at President Herzog's house in the president's home with President Herzog. It's supposed to be a private conversation where we're allowed to speak openly with the president of Israel. I've met President Herzog on 2 other occasions here, and I have to tell you that you're not going to find a more dignified human being than President Herzog. Maybe a worse politician you'll also not find, but he's run for office many times and not won, but I'm certainly not going to be there to give him political advice. So we're there to talk about relationship between Israel and the diaspora. And I have to tell you that if you don't see progress in the idea that Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Jews will sit there and nobody will ask him to come to some kind of Blaustein-Ben Gurion agreement to keep our separation. If you don't see that as progress in 50 years, then I don't know what history we're looking at. Because the 14 of us are going to see how we can bring the American Jewish community and the Israeli community closer together. How we can show up like Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Because we've said to Israel, generation after generation, we have much cattle. We have much cattle. We like living in this place. And we made a deal. The Torah on Shavuot teaches us that we made a deal. And we're reminded today here at VBS, President Kennedy reminded us we made a deal. And the deal is that we are supposed to stand up in America and be proud Jews. And when Israel needs us, we should not be ashamed. And Israel needs us today, perhaps more than ever before. The question of meddling and the question of how that interaction occurs and the question of how to move forward from this very complicated moment, those will all be things that I'll have at the dinner. And believe me, I'll take notes because I don't know if you know this, but high holidays are only 2 months later. I need material. But that dinner, and so many of the dinners and lunches and breakfasts, and I don't know if you've ever been to Israel, but there's a lot of meals and eating and all of the different stops of these meetings. We're going to the Knesset to meet with multiple parties. And we're going to talk to them about ways of opening up a greater sense of dialogue. About how American Jews can interact with Israel on a greater level. And I have to tell you that tonight on Shavuot, the Torah brings for us this promise that I wanted to highlight. And if we're going to tell our story as a diaspora, if we're going to tell our story as Jews, it certainly begins at that mountain and the giving of the document that sits in the ark behind me. And if we're going to tell our stories about the diaspora, it begins in that document. And if we're going to tell stories about what we hope is our future, I've always found that the promises occur back in that document as well. The document's a roadmap for how we're to behave as a people and the pitfalls of how we behave as a people. Tonight on Shavuot, as we consider and reflect on two complicated narratives, we should be grateful. Grateful that we have not only thrived as a community as a result of both of these transformational moments in our history, but we should be grateful that through it all, especially on Shavuot, we've maintained a relationship with each other, and we've maintained a relationship with the Torah. Chag Sameach, everyone. Enjoy the cheesecake outside.
Nixon has been nominated, and Nixon became prominent in national politics through anti-Semitic canards when he ran against Helen Gahagan Douglas in like 1948 or 1950, where he kept calling her Mrs. Gahagan to get the Jewish part of whatever it was that she was. Nixon, however, also could be considered one of the most important presidents in terms of Israel because, yeah, because I mean, now it was done for Soviet, because of Soviet influence.